Okay, cool. All right. So we're talking about building confidence in performers, looking at ways in which we can, help build what we would consider to be a mental skill that's important for performers. So what I'd like to start off with is just talking about the five most common reasons why we lack confidence. And so with that, the first one, and these are not in necessarily any order, these are just the way that they're listed from the source that I pulled them from, which is Russ Harris's book, The Confidence Gap, which is listed in the resources. But the first one is excessive expectations. So perhaps having too much that's on our plate, we're expecting much of ourselves, and to the point where it's maybe beyond our capabilities. It's beyond our sphere of influence. It's beyond what we believe is our potential. So having excessive expectations can certainly set us up for lacking confidence. Number two, harsh self-judgment. So in a sense that when we look at how we're performing or at ourselves in general, we are judging ourselves in a relatively poor manner. So it's not productive for us. We perhaps are seeing ourselves as being less skilled, less abled. And so that judgment in itself is definitely going to be causing us to feel a little less confident in our abilities, in our, ourselves, and able to accomplish a task. I think three is probably the one that we most commonly associate it with, which is a preoccupation with fear. Fear guides a lot. Fear definitely drives a lot of behavior. Sometimes it is productive, and a lot of times it's unproductive or counterproductive. So, of course, we probably are familiar with how fear can definitely lead us to feeling less confident in our abilities to accomplish a task. Four, maybe the same thing. You're asked to do a task and you don't have any experience doing it. That's pretty common. We're asked to do a number of things almost every day, every week, maybe, that is maybe outside of our experience. And so we might say, I don't know how to do that. And so maybe that lack of experience lends into a little bit of fear then, because we don't really know what to do or what to expect. And so we just kind of don't believe that we can do this, or we might just doubt ourselves in this case. And then, of course, a lack of skills. We know what to expect. We know what's being asked of us, but we don't necessarily have the requisite skills, or we at least look at ourselves and evaluate ourselves and say, based on what I know of myself, I don't believe I have these skills. Therefore, I don't feel like I can handle this situation or this task. So those are typically the five most common reasons why we lack confidence. And what I'll do is I'll actually pause here and see if anyone has any suggestions of other ones that I may have missed in those.
Maybe harsh criticism from others, John.
Okay, sure. Getting, you're talking about like from a coach or from a parent or something like that?
Yeah, negative feedback or negative comments, observations, just statements that taken by themselves, one or so is not bad, but if it's a cumulative thing, it can have a pretty negative effect on a player.
Absolutely,
or on
I agree.
Anybody's confidence.
Definitely, I agree with that. That's a good point. All right, I'm gonna keep going here, and we'll keep moving. So the next piece, what I wanted to do then is talk about, once we kind of know why we lack confidence, let's kind of talk about it. So when we talk about confidence, we're talking about efficacy or self-efficacy, which essentially is a person's ability or their belief in their ability to accomplish a task. And typically in the research literature, what you're going to find is confidence being linked to this idea of self-efficacy and focused on by Albert Bandura. And so what Bandura did was he did a research study back in like 1977, looking at how you could take this idea of self-efficacy and can you build back and look at the domains in which what makes it up? Like how, in other words, if I look at self-efficacy, what makes it up? How do I kind of build this efficacy in myself? How do I build this belief? What am I relying upon? What am I looking at? And he came up with these four areas. The first one, which probably most of us are familiar with, is performance accomplishments. So looking at past accomplishments, looking at your history of performances, that tends to be probably the most influential source of confidence. At least that's what he found. So when we look at these four areas, we talk about influential, the influential pieces of confidence, performance experience or past history is probably the one that is the most influential for us. The next he talked about was vicarious experience, which essentially is looking or watching others and learning from them or seeing how others are doing something. And there's a piece to this that's really important, which is when you're watching somebody do it, you're kind of judging yourself based upon them. So you kind of see this person doing it and you say, I'm like this person. And because I'm like them, I believe I can do something very similar. Or I have the same abilities. I believe I have the same capabilities. So if they can do it, I can do it. And the cool thing about this is you can you can learn without making mistakes because you can watch somebody else make the mistakes. And so when you see them make the mistakes, you can then say, well, I know now what I shouldn't do. And so moving forward, I know how I need to act and what I need to avoid doing. And so when you go back to this idea of, preoccupation of fear or, lacking the requisite skills or not knowing what to expect, well, getting a chance to watch, you get a sense for like, oh, they've done it before. Okay, I can probably do the same thing. I don't think that I'm going to make the same mistakes as them because I have these skills to do this. Or maybe you acquired some learning since you watched them actually engage in the activity ahead of time. Think of it like watching kids do a soccer drill or watching somebody maybe do a math problem on the board if we're just talking about in school. So vicarious experience is definitely one that can be leveraged. Now, on the other side of things, this is really interesting. Bruce, you mentioned people speaking to you, getting feedback. So verbal persuasion is essentially another source that we can pull from to build this efficacy or this confidence. And the most interesting thing about this is that this is actually probably the most effective way to increase the confidence of others. And knowing that as coaches, as performers, as leaders, as teachers, we can then utilize this persuasion that we have to, help our students, help our players and all that get better. And so what it really boils down to is the persuasion piece is important, and so is the position of the person giving the feedback. So if, for instance, if I'm looking at Rahul and Rahul and I are peers, if Rahul, I see him as a person who's knowledgeable, who's talented, and he's telling me like, I can do this, you can do this, I'm probably going to feel pretty confident because I'm going to judge myself very similar to him and think that if he knows how to do this, then I'm going to be able to do it too. I trust him. I trust his ability. The same thing's true as a coach and a teacher. If a teacher is giving me feedback or a coach is giving me feedback and telling me that I have the skills, they're pointing these things out to me, then I'm going to feel a little bit more comfortable in approaching some of these tasks. I'm going to believe because they have this knowledge and they're this person of influence or person of importance or a person that has been successful, that they believe I have the skills to do this. So I can then listen to what's going on. I can believe in myself and I can take the attempt and try and do it. Physiological states now is about how you feel physically. And so this is something like with the Army, Rahul and I talked a lot about, this is basically like look good, feel good. And so, think about the times when you've been tasked with doing something and you have been maybe sick or injured, or maybe you didn't get enough sleep. In those instances, you probably didn't really feel confident in your ability to do the task. You might feel like you can do it, but in terms of doing it well, maybe not. So physiological states is about, how you feel physically, how you feel in terms of like nerves or any kind of anxiety that might be manifesting in the body. So these are 4 sources that we can pull this efficacy, this belief from. So past accomplishments, learning from others, persuasion from either peers, maybe even ourselves, and those that we kind of view as being authority figures or people of importance in certain areas that are, coaching and teaching. And lastly, physical states. So in a sense, one of the ways that I have looked at self-efficacy and confidence, and this is in my own work, is I've talked less about confidence and more about trust. Because when I talk to athletes and they tell me that they don't feel confident. They seem to be preoccupied with this feeling. And that, in a sense, can be a distraction, particularly because if they're relying upon a feeling of confidence and they have to do something, if they've never done it before, they're probably not going to feel confident doing it. So if they're waiting for this feeling to come, they're going to be waiting for a long time. So on the other side of it, what I'll say is we're actually talking about trust. And so when we leverage confidence more as trust than as this feeling, then we can talk about ways in which we can build trust. And if you look at those situations that we talked about, each of those areas, past experiences, learning from others or vicarious experience, being persuaded or being told, given feedback by others, and physical states can certainly make us feel like we can build trust from those areas. And so that is one thing, one way that I reframe this idea of confidence, is to talk more about trust as opposed to confidence. And even when an athlete uses the word confidence with me, I'll use the word trust back with them. So they're saying, I don't feel confident. I go, so you don't trust yourself to handle this? And they'll say, well, I just don't feel confident. I go, well, it's, what you're essentially saying to me is you don't trust yourself. And why is that? And then we can go through and talk about past performances and how he might leverage those things. And Rahul did mention that today he would like to talk about how he has actually done some work looking at past experiences and how he's, used that with soldiers. So we'll definitely ask him for some input there. And then lastly, the other myth that I really try to debunk with athletes and people is that confidence is not self-esteem. Those are two different things. So when people say, I just don't feel confident, and I'm listening to what they're saying, sometimes what they're actually saying is, I don't feel like I'm able to do this, but not from a sense of their ability, but because they're not worthy of doing it. And self-esteem is more about worth or self-worth, not about ability to do something. And if we look at research that's looking at performance, there is no correlation between self-esteem and high performance, because you can have really low self-esteem, really low self-worth, and perform really well. We see a lot when you look at athletes who have drug issues, musicians and artists and performers that have drug and alcohol issues or risky behavior issues. Those tend to be indicators of low self-worth, but they have really good skills and high ability to do their craft really well. So I want to make sure that we're debunking this idea that confidence is the same as self-esteem. It's not. And so therefore, because of that, we can make that differentiation and start to steer away and build more along that lines of trust. And so what I wanted to focus on for sure is one area which a lot of coaches talk about confidence, and that typically is with self-talk. So we talk about persuasion. And I know Bruce mentioned, coaching and feedback and speaking to athletes. That's the kind of persuasion that we're talking about here. But usually when you're talking with a sports psych perspective, we talk a lot about confidence being related to self-talk, how you're talking to yourself in those moments that are difficult, that are challenging, that are new, that are unique, and making sure that it is productive or it's doing something for you. And so, again, something that we used with the military was talking about this idea of good self-talk or productive self-talk having some components to it. And so the first thing I want to make sure we're differentiating is that there can be two types of self-talk. Instructional, which is good for, fine motor skills, like I'm talking about thread the needle through the eye or thread the thread through the eye opening of the needle. That would be self-talk that I would be talking myself through. It's guiding me, it's giving me instructions, it's telling me what I should do. On the other side, we get motivational. It's boosting our confidence and thus leading us to high performance. And when we look at these things, we're trying to get a sense of how can we make some really good self-talk? How can we make sure that our self-talk is helpful for us? It's doing something for us. It's giving us that confidence, helping us build our belief. So the one aspect is looking at what are these pieces. And the first thing is looking at the P3 side, we're talking about purposeful, meaning it's, let me see how I do this because I always mess up. So Rahul, feel free to jump in if I get this wrong. Purposeful, we're talking about it is, Actually, Rahul, jump in here and help me with purposeful.
So it's with intent, like it's a directed thought, that it's not
Right.
just like a blanket statement or anything like that. Yeah.
Yes, right. That's right. Purposeful being that it's got an intent for it. It's going to be doing something for you. Productive is going to be purposeful is, I mean, it's there for a reason. You've planned for it to be there. It's serving a purpose. Productive is going to be it's doing something for you. It's going to be either giving you that motivation to push you further. It's going to be hopefully keeping you engaged in a situation that's really challenging. So it's doing something for you. And then possibility is more like it's within your ability to do it. It's not outside your capabilities. You're not trying for something that is, something that's too far to get it. You're actually able to do what you're trying to do here. It's in your capabilities. Versus on the other side, it's like also possibilities, like it's like an I can attitude. It's like very productive driven. It's very much focusing on what you can do versus what you can't do. The other side, random is the opposite of purposeful. So random, it just pops up like it's unplanned. It's there, or it's about something just random. Reactive, it tends to be as a result of something happening to you. So instead of like having it, pre-planned to do something for you, it's just something that just kind of gets thrown out there, and it's reactive to something that you experience. So maybe you strike out in a game, or you make an error in soccer, and that first thought that pops in there is probably going to be reactive to making that error and having that mistake. And the last piece, it's going to be it's restrictive, meaning that it's going to prevent you or be restrictive in terms of what it's going to do for you. It's not going to help you get any further. It's going to be debilitating. It can be like an I can't approach. I can't do X. I'm not able to do blank. So these are the components that we typically talk to our individual athletes about, or at teams about. Just if you're going to use self-talk, which a lot of teams do, a lot of people like it, these are the components that we really hammer on. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions that are from you guys. So talking about anything so far, you guys have any questions or anything you want to touch on?
I have a question.
Sure.
It might not, sort of pertains, but with like the verbal persuasion.
Yeah.
How would you recommend like combating? So like I try to instill all those things in my players, but how do you combat the negative verbal talk from the sidelines, other assistant coaches, parents, where they hear that in their one ear and then they're hearing you in the other ear, and they're kind of trying to figure out which route to take?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll answer part of that, and I'll throw out there to Rahul and Scott and anybody else that thinks they want to jump in on it too. But the first thing I would say is self-talk doesn't always have to be positive. We tend to look at it more like it should be productive, meaning it should do something for you. So while there might be some comments coming from the sideline, and you might believe that is, being ingrained into your players and whatever else, what I would be more mindful of is listening to see what they're saying to themselves, or even asking them what they're saying to themselves in those moments to see if it is working for them or not. Because like almost something like, you can't do this can certainly be a restrictive thought. Or it could be a person using that internal voice as motivation to push themselves harder, almost like it's like they're going to use it as like I'll show you. So it becomes like this this voice of maybe somebody that they don't like. That's kind of somebody that they want to stick it to a little bit. They're motivated to kind of show this person up, like, oh yeah, I'll show you, kind of thing. So I would be mindful of trying to learn more about what their self-talk looks like or sounds like, and then building back and saying, is it working for you or not? And I think part of that also goes into having a good relationship with them. Like they'll be able to trust sharing that with you, so they're not going to feel like you're going to judge them for that. So you might have to model that first. But I'll pause there and let anybody else weigh in on that too. Rahul's giving me the thumbs up.
So John, I think it's interesting. You hear when you talk to players and you talk to parents, you talk to coaches, oftentimes you hear the kind of what comes first, the chicken or the egg. And I'm going to say that, what comes first? You play and you gain confidence, or you have to have confidence and then you get playing time. And it's interesting. My observation of many, many players over the years is that works both ways. I mean, some players, they've got confidence and therefore they know they should be playing. Other players get the confidence by being recognized that they should be playing, and they gain more playing time and their confidence rises. So I think a lot of it is the individual makeup of the player. Just like we're all made up differently, things that trigger us one way or the other, either positively or negatively. And I use this with my kids all the time. I said, whether you believe you can or you can't, you'll be right. And so how do you make sure that you're thinking positively? And how do we support you in that endeavor? And I know I'm tough on players. You've seen me coach, I think, John, and you know that my training sessions are pretty intense. And my players will say the same thing. But I do give compliments in this form. If I'm really being hard on a player, I don't say you stink, but I'll say, I know you're better than that. And so right away they're thinking, I don't want to let him down. I don't want to let myself down. I don't want to let my team down. He's telling me that he knows I can do this. But right now I'm not. I'm kind of trapped in whatever the exercise is, and I can't get my head wrapped around it. So I guess, and that doesn't work with every player. They're all different. So that would be, my observation about kind of how does this work with confidence in players.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point. It goes back to like waiting for these feelings of confidence to come. They're likely not to come. So just acting and doing, you're likely to probably make mistakes, but you're likely to probably forget that you're not feeling confident and you just get engaged with the activity. And so my recommendation is always actions of confidence come first, meaning you do what you know you need to do for the task, playing wise, if you're giving a speech, giving a presentation, etc. So you just go and do it. So you train that, like you practice that, you do what you've been practicing, and then allow those feelings to come later. Because if you get engaged with what you're going to be doing, you're probably going to lose track of the fact that that feeling of confidence isn't there, because you're going to get completely engaged in what you're doing. So I think that's a really good point, Bruce. I think, like you said, whether you believe you can or you can't, you're right. It's probably true. And so because of that, if you believe you can't, how do we get you moving? Maybe that starts off with then having them start on like one task that's going to build them to get them where they need to go. So, I like the comment that you made about, I know you're better than that, or you can do better. That is a way of showing that you know my abilities as a player and that you trust that I can get better. And therefore I look at you as an authority figure of like, Bruce has got a lot of knowledge. He's a good coach. And so if my coach believes I can do this, then I'm going to keep trying. And hopefully, coach is going to be on me about making some corrections and give me some feedback, and I'll get better. Versus like, if I don't say anything to you after that, or I just say you stink, like you had mentioned, I'm probably not going to feel as though coach has my back, and I'm probably going to get discouraged and all that stuff. So I'm definitely not going to build courage there, or confidence there. So I think those are really, really good points there. And Carrie, going back to your question, it is a lot of modeling. It is certainly trying to model, and when you're hearing it, you're jumping on it and maybe reframing, like, can you give me an example of what you're hearing from parents or anything?
Like parents that just harp on their daughters, like when they're not they feel they're not working hard enough, and they're screaming at them, and from my opinion, they're 9, they're working as hard as they can, and they're doing good things. And I just, every time they come off the field, I always want them to come to me first, and I always, give them a positive, give them something to work on, and and then they go get their drink. But I just kind of want them to tune that negativity out sometimes and just try their best. So I don't know. Parents that harp on them, scream,
Sure. Mike, you got something
you
there?
know, I don't know. I find out like quit messing up, like work harder, things like that.
I'll jump in because I've seen some of exactly what Carrie's talking about, and I think a lot of it too is maybe not necessarily exactly what they're saying, but how they're saying it too, the tone. And as a 7-year-old, 9-year-old, these kids are going to have a hard time differentiating between that. So I think that's part of it too. And there's definitely some parents that overspeak the coach. That you're going to have that at any age, but I think for a young kid especially, it's hard to not listen to your parents when you're always told to listen to your parents. So I think that's probably one of the hardest parts too.
Yeah. What I would suggest, and I don't know if you guys have this ability, is having these conversations with parents at the beginning of the season. Because one of the things that, when it comes to our job as people who do mental performance, it's not just working with the individual athlete. It's actually a holistic approach, which is going to be more effective. And speaking directly to parents and letting them know, hey, look, when you're on the sideline and you're communicating in these ways, you're sending a message whether you mean to or not. And so if you are going to be doing that, let's make sure that we're building and we're not becoming destructive. And in a sense, can we frame some of the stuff that we're saying in like for work ethic? Can we frame it in a way that the kids understand it, they can improve it? You've got this, like as Bruce said, I know you're capable of better. Let's keep going, keep trying. It's one or two extra things that could be said that could actually be really beneficial, and it will likely make your guys' lives easier as coaches. But Carrie, I like the approach that you mentioned, though, that you have them come to you and you give them immediate feedback. You give them an immediate piece of like a really good one would be something like, I saw you do this, and really label it and say, I really liked when you did this. And that shows me that you're getting better at blank. And then it can be literally that 30-second interaction, and off they go get a drink of water. And you've just shown that the kid's making improvement, you care about their development. And so you're kind of fostering this coaching alliance that you have with your player, this coach athlete alliance, versus like just leaving it go, like they come off the field and they go get a drink of water. You're actually addressing it right off the bat and giving the kids some good feedback right off the bat when they come off, and they're hearing it from a coach that they have a good relationship with. They value your opinion, they value your input, and so you're probably doing a lot of good sitting in that space doing that. Scott, do you have anything you want to say about that? I saw you.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here too. So one thing that comes to mind is, and Carrie, I'm not exactly sure kind of the logistics of where you're at in the season and things like that. So I'll leave kind of what I'm about to say. So take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt in terms of how you may fit this in. What's coming to my mind is I'd be curious to know if the athletes, the 9-year-old athletes, have been asked by their parents or by you, the coach, what's most helpful for you to hear while you're playing?
Mm-hmm.
The flip side of that coin is have you asked the parents if they have asked their children what is most helpful for them to hear when they're playing? My assumption, at least in my experience, the answer would be no. And I'd be curious if kind of that may be low-hanging fruit to open up a conversation to be like, yeah, let's talk about self-talk. Let's talk about encouragement. Let's talk about the different ways in which we can encourage, the different tones in which we can encourage, messages that are more effective or maybe less effective. And maybe if there's some low-hanging fruit to be able to open up that door. Because oftentimes parents assume that they know what's most helpful. And I'm not a parent, so this is strictly based upon kind of experiences working with just humans. A lot of times parents will assume that they know what is most helpful, but they actually won't even ask their children, right? And there's a shame to that. And I wonder if you could provide some power to that, to be able to name that and then specify and also kind of train while instilling kind of train the trainer type model with the parents, and if there's some room to work in that area. So just food for thought and fitting it in, obviously whatever you feel would be appropriate, but just a thought that came to mind.
Yeah. Carrie, any thoughts about that? Does that sound pretty good for you?
Yeah, I mean, I always try to like get one-on-one time with each player at some point. And so that is something that, I do like to have conversations with them, but I've never thought of asking, that question. Like, I mean, I've asked them like, what can I do to help you, learn this skill, but I haven't sometimes I don't think they quite hear anything when they're out there. Sometimes like they just tune everything. But but that is thoughtful. I think that's something I could use for sure.
Yeah, and even to like build off of that, Carrie. So then it's like 3 questions. Number 1, do you even hear anything on the field, or are you kind of like really focused, right? Maybe a
Yeah.
yes or no, and it could vary, and that's okay. The second thing is like, if you do hear something, what would be the most helpful thing that I say? Like, what really helps motivate you?
Mhm.
And then the third question would be, what's really helpful to hear from your parents that motivates you? And like, is something I say different than what your parents say? I'd be curious to know like what's that about, or if there are differences or what that looks like, right? And facilitating that discussion, and then, I mean, the mind's just kind of running off now, so I'll try and confine it. Maybe a fourth question then is like, do your parents know that you think this, or like, do your parents know that this is most helpful? Right? So you can take that in 1,000 different directions. I'm going to kind of reel my mind back in here, but yeah, I think that's a great avenue to have that, not only rapport building moments, but then asking some of these questions, and then you can kind of take this information and use it in other strategic ways to further support. So yeah, cool.
Yeah. Carrie, the one thing that sticks out to me, and I'll make sure I throw this in the follow-up email. So by all means, hopefully Mike will share the email, or I can get your email at some point. Because usually follow up these calls with sending the notes out, and we'll send the video that we recorded and stuff like that. But there's a number of resources that are aimed at like that whole idea of growth mindset and asking questions, better questions to ask on the car ride home, right? As opposed to just saying, how do you think you played? Well, that's great. Like, that's a great question. As opposed to just having the conversation of, you didn't play well, you did play well, you scored X goals, whatever. You turn the conversation to the individual, the kid, and ask them questions that make them think about their performance. And doing that helps them think a little bit deeper and start to realize things about like effort and things about like growing and developing as possible. You mentioned, how do you help them kind of notice that they're making growth? Well, here's a great way to do it. Ask the questions in the car. You can then ask the same questions when you see them the next day at practice or whatever. You're just allowing them to reflect on their performances, and that really will help kind of shift that mindset towards that idea that they can get better, that it's not always about winning and losing. It's development is the goal. So I'll make a note to put that in the send home stuff. So I'll do that right now. Yeah, so I'm gonna keep going real quick because I got a couple more things for you, and we'll keep moving. All right. So we mentioned persuasion, or I mentioned persuasion here. So the next piece, I did want to talk about Gervais here, and I gotta reset this here. I got to reshare and share sound so you guys can see this. So to give you some background, Michael Gervais is probably one of the most popular sports psychologists that's out there right now. Works for the Seattle Seahawks. He has his own podcast, which gets, I think, probably a couple thousand downloads at a time. Definitely millions of downloads in its history. He's been doing it for years, but he is probably one of the most outspoken, most visible people in the field. And so this is a brief little snippet. It's only a minute and 10, 12 seconds about kids and confidence and overcoming failures. So I think he makes a couple of good points here. So I'm going to let him play and we'll go from there.
One of the things that we've learned from some of the greatest coaches in the world is that training and practice is where failure is best observed. And so we want to support children to understand failure. We want to support them that with mistakes, with losses, with failure, That's where we learn how to get better. That's where we learn how to become more proficient at what we're doing. So failure in a moment is something that helps in that process. So if we can structure opportunities where people are met with a challenge, where they might fail, they might make a mistake, they might not be proficient, it's part of the sting, it's part of the pain that allows people to grow, to move forward. And so we want to be able to structure opportunities in practice, in everyday life, where they might meet failure. And if we can do that on a basis where we're really supporting who they are, and we're not judging them for the mistakes that they make, then we can help them engage in opportunities where they're going to test themselves and deal with the failure, not avoid it, but know how to work through it. One of the things that we've learned from some of the
So in looking at that, one of the thoughts that comes to mind is that idea of persuasion. So it's less about the failure, less about the mistakes, like making them, and the idea that you need to avoid making mistakes. You need to avoid, in some cases, looking bad, because a lot of people don't like to look bad. But it's almost reestablishing a relationship with fear of failure, fear of making mistakes. And that then allows that learning experience, that prior experience, to be less or more helpful and more inviting to look at, so that you can say, in this time, I failed when I did this, but here's the reason why, and here's what I learned from it. And that, in a sense, then builds that trust that you're not going to make those same mistakes again, and you can go forward and do some good work. So I really like the way he was framing that. And I think we kind of touched on some of these things about trying to address the whole person and not just talking specifically about failure and trying to avoid making mistakes, and trying to help kids be more willing to make an effort to put themselves out there, to try, even when they're not feeling so confident. And so here's some strategies. And this is kind of the whole bread and butter of tonight, giving you some ideas for how to do this confidence thing. So I'll start with the first one. I'm a big fan of journaling, and a lot of kids aren't, and that's okay. But I will always recommend journaling, because with journaling, you can always go back and look at it, which is a great way to go back and review past experiences, past successes, past failures, and you can learn from them. So if you journal well and you reflect well and you revisit, you should hopefully have a nice way or a nice system built for yourself to go and say, you know what? I may not have the exact skills for this moment, but I did do something similar in the past. And when I did, here is what I did. Here's what I was successful. Here's what I wasn't. So let me make these changes and try. And any of these journals could work. It could be a training journal, or it could be a competition journal. Any one of them will work. You can definitely have a collection of stuff to go back and refer to. It becomes really, really helpful. Goal setting. So when we talk about goal setting, we typically talk about SMART goals. However, there is now, well, not now, there's another template out there called the SMARTer format, which is very similar to the SMART goal, which is specific, measurable, action-focused, realistic, time-bound. But here is where confidence can come in. You evaluate the process. And so you're looking at what progress or maybe lack of progress you've made. And then the R is readjusting, or you revisit, or you revise. And so because of that, you now have the ability to reflect on your past experiences again and use that for leverage to perhaps have some success. If things aren't working for you and you're trying along this process with this goal, maybe before that time hits, that before you get to that T mark, you have a point of reflection. And so you say, well, halfway through this goal, I'm going to go back and I'm going to evaluate my progress and see where I'm at. So maybe even incorporating some journals here, you might refer back to a journal you're keeping and say, based on what I've got listed here, I think I'm on track. I think I'm doing really well. That's going to build some confidence. It's going to build some trust in their abilities. They're going to feel good about what they're doing, and they're going to feel pretty empowered to go forward, like they can continue to meet this goal. Or on the other side, you're giving them the ability to go back and look at something making sure that they either are or aren't on track. And if they aren't, hey, we can make adjustments. It's okay if we have to make adjustments, that's fine, but we're going to make sure that we're going to build some success in here for you. So let's revise this a little bit and let's move forward. Imagery, using visualization practices, typically a really good one is best practices. So, or best performances, sorry. So having them think about prior performances in which they're, doing their best, playing their best, and having them just think through, what were you doing well? What did it look like? Or even just run through like a highlight reel in their head, just to kind of remind them that, hey, I've done this before, I've played this game before, and I've seen myself doing it. And the brain has a really difficult time differentiating between some mental images and actual performances. So could we do that? Could do some preparatory imagery, which is you think in advance of what you might need to do, and then you imagine yourself doing it. So get as much information as you can about the upcoming event, upcoming performance, upcoming thing for that matter, and then try to imagine yourself doing it. Giving a speech, fine. Imagine yourself walking up to the podium. Imagine yourself taking a deep breath. Imagine yourself running through your speech, answering questions. Okay, got a soccer game. Maybe it's a big game coming up. All right, so Jimmy Walker is going down to the NCAA tournaments here pretty soon. So what he might do is have his girls start to imagine, hey, we might go to penalties. So let's imagine ourselves being in penalties. Let's imagine yourself walking up to the penalty spot, putting the ball down, picking your corner, running up, striking the ball really well, and boom, hitting the back of the net. Seeing all that stuff in your mind just makes the brain believe that it's been there before. It helps you feel more comfortable and confident in some situations that you may not have been in before. And so you're setting themselves up to believe that they have the ability to be there. Mastery practice. If you look over here in the bottom corner, we talk about the confidence cycle. Now, this again is from Russ Harris, which it's basically just a reflection piece. You practice something, and then you take the skills and you try to apply them, whether it be in a game, in a practice themselves, or at home. And here's the key. You assess what's going on. You think deeply about it, and you modify as you need to. Make changes, make adjustments, make it more simple for you, make it more challenging. It just depends on what it is. And therefore, you repeat the system again. So you try again, you go again. So you're running through this whole process: practice, apply, assess, modify, and keep going. And I like to make this this distinction. Mastery practice is not practicing for mastery. Of course, we want to do that. This is about establishing a practice itself. This is less a verb and more of a noun. This is a thing, having a practice of practicing. So for me right now, a lot of my work is relating around meditation. So I have a meditation practice. I practice meditating, but I also have a meditation practice. I do it every day. I do it deliberately. I really work on it. The next one, evaluations and personal performance plans. So as coaches, as performers, as teachers, we typically give evaluations to our players. And so with those, can we then develop personal performance plans which they can measure? They might have goals tied to them, and then follow up with them in one-on-one interactions to track progress. How are you doing? What do you need help with? Where can I assist you? What's been most beneficial for you? Where's the biggest obstacle for you? All these conversations, all these questions you can ask can definitely help to build that trust for these individuals. I highly recommend it. And it's probably one of the most effective ways you can build rapport, you can build a good relationship, and really work towards having some really good success and progress with your athletes. The last one, confidence jar. This is actually something that Missy Franklin, who's a swimmer for the U.S. national team, or was for the U.S. Olympic team, uses or has used in the past. All you do is you get a jar, and you would think about past performances that you are really proud of, the ones in which you worked really hard and that you were really successful in. It can be anything. It's going to be relatable to the person. And what you do is you write those things down and you throw them in a jar. And then you put that jar someplace that you can, maybe it's next to your bed. You wake up in the morning and you pull out one and you just look at it, you read it, and you just remind yourself what that situation was like. You do like a little highlight of like, yeah, that's right. That did happen to me. That was something I was really proud of. And then you put it right back in the jar and you go about your day. But the idea is you're providing that evidence, whether it be the physical state, the vicarious learning experience, the past performances, you name it, you can put them in there. And then you pull them out and use them to leverage your confidence and help to build more of that trust in your ability and feel like you actually belong in the place that you're going to go perform and do. And so that's all that I wanted to offer, but here's where I wanted to offer the chance for anybody to offer up maybe some ideas that they have. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and I'll come back to the group. And does anybody have anything that they use or they've done to do this?
I'll piggyback off of the one-to-one performance.
Yeah.
We had 2 games this past weekend, and Saturday's game was not the best play from the girls. They just weren't connecting. They weren't using things that we were practicing. So on Sunday during warmups, I pulled each girl aside during warmups and I talked with each girl and I gave them one thing that they did well that I wanted them to focus on in that game and make sure that they actually performed. And we beat a team that we have played 6 times previous and we have lost every time, and we kicked their butt 5-2. And each girl really, it just was amazing. Like I was on cloud 9 after the game and I really think that the one-to-one conversation kind of helped. The one thing that I need to do better is the follow-up. I don't necessarily follow up with each kid after, we have that initial conversation, but I think that does wonders for kids.
Absolutely. What you're talking about there, Carrie, is something that, a number of people use for like a performance reflection is like a well, better, how. Like you're kind of helping them think about what did they do really well. And then ideally is once they can identify that, or you can help them identify that, they can then replicate that, because that's going to be obviously key. And then another step for that is then the better piece is like, what is it that we can do to get better, or what can you do individually to get better? And then you give them to actually think about how they can get better. So that's the last piece. So you say, okay, so if that's what you did well, let's focus on doing that for the next game for sure. Go to practice and say, okay, so what could we be better at? What do we need to improve on? And how can we do it? And then you put like the power back on them to choose and then figure out how they can improve. You're kind of giving them choice and some autonomy there. So taking ownership. That's good though. I think that's a really great strategy. And I guarantee it's something simple and it would work probably at youth all the way up through higher levels too. Rahul, I know that we had spoke, and so I wanted you guys to not just hear from me, but Rahul has had some experience with working with some, in this case, it's a soldier, I believe. So I'll let him kind of talk about what his experience has been. And this is actually looking at it from like a coaching an individual to actually build this confidence. So it's not like Rahul was his leader or like a coach. He's actually like a performance expert coming in to actually specifically build this skill or this trait in this individual. So Rahul, I'll let you take it away.
Sure thing. Thank you, John. So just being cognizant of time, I definitely want to make sure I'm respectful of that. There was a training that John and I had conducted with a military police company when we were working at Bragg, and there was a soldier that had followed up afterwards. He was like, hey, I'm going into special forces school or special forces training. I really want to just work with you guys, see what I can gain, and just in terms of preparing mentally, physically, he was doing everything, he was going on rucks, he was working out, he was doing everything he could to be physically ready, but he wanted to make sure his mental game was also pretty sharp just going in. So already, some of the things that John talked about was not just like that physical readiness or not just like physical feeling of being prepared to be able to do something. This guy's also talking about the mental aspect as well. So just a super quick crash course just about special forces. So to become a special forces soldier within the U.S. Army, you have to go to what's called Special Forces Assessment and Selection, which is roughly like a 30-day course where you're put through different kinds of team activities, different kinds of physical activities. There's different kinds of coordination events and whatnot. And then afterwards, you go to what's called the qualification course, or the Q course, where it's actually learn and go through the schooling to become a Special Forces soldier. And then after that point, you earn your tab. And so there's a bunch of different schools, obviously, within that, depending on what you want to do within special forces. So this particular individual, Sergeant Reyes, he wanted to become an engineer. So that was kind of like where he was angling towards. So in talking to him and working with him, the biggest thing that we realized is that, you can't necessarily be prepared for every kind of situation that you're going to experience in selection. You have to pass selection in order to be able to go on to the Q course. So it's not worth focusing on the Q course quite just yet. It's about getting through those first 20, 25 days, 28 days, whatever it was. And so the biggest thing that we talked about with him was just developing a toolkit. What can I use if, there's a situation and I haven't done it previously? I'm not ready for this. So the biggest thing with confidence with him that I think a lot of people tend to miss just in sort of conversations or when they're working with someone is being comfortable in a situation where you don't have confidence about anything. What can you do when you're not confident about something? And one of the big things that we talked about was just, you can still be confident in your support of maybe someone else. Maybe you can't be the leader in a situation. Maybe you don't have the plan. Maybe you're not the idea guy, but how can you support the people who are and kind of bring the confidence about them? Because even if you may not have individual confidence, if you have group confidence, well, you're either all going down together or you're all going up together. So that was one of the big things that we talked about with him. And I think that was a perspective that he hadn't really considered before. And I think especially when it comes to that kind of those upper echelon, different units in the military, the team aspect becomes really big. The military just in general, when you go in, you're going through basic training, regardless of what branch you're in, the team aspect is so hammered into you that you always have to constantly think about who's on your left and right, who's in front of you, who's behind you, and taking care of those people. Because you take care of them and they extend that same courtesy to you, that same responsibility to you, you're able to kind of grow together. So that was one of the big things that we talked about. One of my favorite books that I've ever read is the autobiography by Colonel Chris Hadfield. He's a Canadian astronaut. Shout out to you, Scott. And one of the favorite things, my favorite thing that he talked about in his book was that in any given situation, you can be a -1, a 0, or a +1. +1 is that person who always takes charge in the situation, who's kind of like the leader, who's really pushing the group. Or you can be a 0 in a situation. You're not taking away from the situation. You're not adding to it, where you're supporting what's going on. You're serving as, whether that's leading by example, you're serving as just support in that situation. Or you can be a -1, and that's that person that takes away from everything. It's kind of, ruining things, just trying to take charge when you shouldn't be taking charge, or trying to, lead the group astray, whatever it might be. And so I think the way that confidence relates to that is you can be confident in being a 0. It's not always about being a +1, that you can be confident in just supporting and just doing what you can, even if it's not everything that you can do. And I have no idea if he passed Special Forces school or not. We don't have any kind of closure to the story. Unfortunately, left the job prior to that point. But definitely, I think he seemed to be, his confidence just going in was very, very different. And I think worked for about 4 or 5 weeks before he was designated to go to Special Forces selection. And you could tell just that over that time, it wasn't that his confidence was growing, but he was more so confident about being prepared for the unprepared, that no matter what came up, you could either support himself, support his teammates, support the other people going through it. And I think that hopefully made a big impact on him just moving forward from there.
Nice. Thanks, Rahul. I appreciate that. And I think just tapping on that, one thing that Bandura says, that's the guy who has the whole idea of self-efficacy, is that regardless of whether you have done something before or not, you can usually find something that's relatable to the task that you do have experience with. You just have to sit and think about it. So while it might not be the exact same thing, you might have, in this case, if you're nervous about playing in front of a group of people for a game wise, you might have given a performance in class. You may have given a speech in class. You may have, done something in front of other people. It may not be the same venue, may not be the same demands, but there's probably a relationship that you can find somewhere. So trying to leverage that past experience for sure is going to be helpful, because remember, that's the most influential source of confidence as an individual. We're talking about building it, that's the persuasion. But from an individual standpoint, having them reflect on, hey, you haven't been in this situation exactly, but you've been in one like it. And how did you handle these moments? What did you do? What did you do well? What mistakes did you make? And how can you avoid making those mistakes again? Those can be some questions that you can use to help leverage that situation. So, all right, again, noticing time, I'm actually done with the presentation. That's all the slides I have. I will certainly pass those out like I usually do in the email, but I do want to offer the chance for you guys to ask some questions.
I'm good. I just want to thank you for allowing me to come and listen. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. By all means, Carrie, feel free
I
about
have
jumping
questions.
back at some point. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, John, same here. This is my first foray in with the group. I'm really glad that you invited me. I thought at first it was just kind of closed to pace setter coaches. So then I begged Danny as an ex pace setter coach, could I join the group? And so I really appreciate it. I'm going to make sure that I make as many of these as I possibly can.
Sure.
But I really do appreciate the invite. This is very helpful.
Of course. I will say, to give you guys a heads up, the May one, I believe, we're talking about mindfulness, which is going to be, I think, really beneficial for us as just people in general. But in June, it's going to be an open forum. So what I'm going to do on the email is I'm going to send out a form. So when you see it, just click on it, and then I'll just ask you, what topic would you like to see discussed in that open forum? And then what we'll do is we'll probably poll everybody in May to say, here's the suggestions. Let's pick one and roll with it for June. So it'll be a group directed conversation again. So I don't always want to be dominating these conversations. I actually don't really like to talk as much as I am. So, yeah. But otherwise, if you guys have nothing else, I do appreciate you popping in here. I know it's a small group tonight, but that's okay. We still got a chance to talk and discuss and have some fun. And then I'll send out the follow-up email, and we'll hopefully see you guys again in a month.
Great. Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Yep. You're welcome.
Thanks, John.
See you guys.
Yep. Yeah.
See you, Rob.